His grandmother had been right all along. His grandmother, the fisherman's wife, with the stockings fallen down around her ankles and her faintly mustachioed upper lip rising and falling in ceaseless incantation, had perceived the world more keenly than philosophers and presidents, pharmacists and ad men. She'd seen through the veil of Maya, seen the world for what it was, a haunted place where anything could happen and nothing was as it seemed, where shadows had fangs and doom festered in the blood.
The Hudson River Valley, New York State. Writer T. Coraghessan Boyle was born and raised here in northern Westchester, just up the river from Tarrytown, where Washington Irving created his legends. Boyle is the author of more than a half-dozen novels and story collections. Acclaimed as one of the most inventive writers of his generation, his honors include the prestigious PEN-Faulkner Award. T.C. Boyle now lives in Los Angeles, but he returned to this landscape of his youth for the setting of his third novel. World's End follows the intertwined fates of three families in the Hudson River Valley, from the Dutch settlers of the 17th century to the anti-communist riots of 1949, to the social upheaval of the rock and roll generation of 1968. Tell me about this marker and how it found its way into World's End.
Well, as you know, the main character, Walter, has a motorcycle accident and loses his foot, smashing into a marker very similar to this. After I'd left New York, I was living in Los Angeles, I would come back here and visit a dear friend who lived across the street up there. Every day for exercise, I would take this path down through the woods to the river. And, ignoring history as I always have throughout my life, I ignored this sign. But one day I read it, and it amazed me to see that this path, and there are no hot dog stands here, as you can see, no neon lights. This path is still used by people, goes down to the river, and it's the very one that Benedict Arnold had used all these years ago. And I could have gone by this sign a million times, and it meant nothing to me. I mean, why should it? And part of the reason for writing World's End was to atone for that, to connect myself to the history of this area. They teach you about the Revolutionary War in the schools right here, but they never point out that it happened right outside the window. And seeing this sign was a revelation to me. I mean, really thinking about it. Next thing Walter knew, he was on his bike. It was a horse, a fire-breathing, shit-kicking terror. A big top-of-the-line Norton Commando that could jerk the fillings out of your molars. The washed-out, bird-bedeviled dawn flashing by on either side of him like the picture on a black-and-white portable with a bad horizontal hold. He was invincible, immortal, impervious to the hurts and surprises of the universe, coming out of Peekskill at 95. The road cut left, and he cut with it. There was a dip, a rise. He clung to the machine like a new coat of paint. 100, 105, 110. He was heading home, the night a blur. Had he passed out in the back of Hector's car on the way back from Dunderberg? Heading home to the bed of an existential hero above the kitchen in his adoptive parents' clapboard bungalow. It was dew on the road. It wasn't light yet. And then all at once, as if a switch had been thrown inside his head, he was slowing down. Whatever it was that had got him up to 110 had suddenly left him. He let off on the throttle, took it down, 90, 80, 70, only mortal after all. Up ahead on the right, he barely noticed it, had been by it 1,000 times, 10,000, was a historical marker. Blue and yellow, a rectangle cut out of the gloom. What was it, iron? Raised letters, yellow or gold against the blue background. Poor suckers probably made them down at Sing Sing or something. There was a lot of history in the area, he supposed, George Washington, Benedict Arnold, and all of that. But history really didn't do much for him. Fact is, he'd never even read the inscription on the thing. Never even read it. For all he knew, it could have commemorated one of Lafayette's bowel movements or the discovery of the onion. It was nothing to him. Something along the side of the road, that's all. Slow down, bad curve, oak tree, billboard, historical marker, driveway. Even now, he wouldn't have given it a second glance if it weren't for the shadow that suddenly shot across the road in front of him. That shadow was nothing recognizable. No rabbit, possum, coon, or skunk, just a shadow. Caused him to jerk the handlebars. And that jerk caused him to lose control. Yes. And that loss of control put him down for an instant on the right side, down on the new dingo boot with the imitation spur strap, put him down before he could straighten up, and made him hit that blue and yellow sign with a jolt that was worthy of a major god.
Tell me about your approach to dealing with historical material and writing a historical novel.
I absorbed the history of the period. For instance, I've also written my first novel, Water Music, about Mungo Park's explorations of Africa in 1795. The history of a period and area may fascinate me, and then I'll read as much as I can about it, and the process of that reading will suggest a story to me. Then I begin the story.
What does World's End owe to Washington Irving?
Pretty much everything. Washington Irving is the guiding inspiration for the book. His Knickerbocker's History of New York is a hilarious, very inventive rethinking of the assumed story about New York and its Dutch founding. It's just hilarious. He invents all sorts of Dutch terminology, which I've borrowed from my book, and makes pure fun of the whole notion of the staid patroons and all of that. And also, I think he's written two stories that are part of the American mythic consciousness that everyone knows, no matter where you go. I mean, half the people on the street don't even know who the president is, but everyone knows who Rip Van Winkle is. Everyone knows the Headless Horseman from The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and Ichabod Crane. And to do something like that, that would pervade the American consciousness in that way, to me, is close to miraculous.
And how did you begin to write this novel, World's End? Was it through literature, life?
No, actually, I bought some paper, and I put it in my typewriter, and I drank a cup of tea, and I started typing. Really.
How did you select the matrix of dates that you were going to focus on, the 17th century, 1968, 69, 1949?
The themes of the book suggested certainly 1949 and 1969. Another key impetus to this book was the fact that a blight had been on Peekskill throughout my life, and it was the Peekskill riots of 1949 when Paul Robeson had come here to give a concert. It was really, I think, the first stirrings of the civil rights movement, and the locals turned out to prevent this concert from happening because of Paul Robeson's communist associations and because of the fact that the Communist Party was sponsoring the event. And there were two riots on successive weekends, and they're very bloody riots. I wanted to explore what that meant in terms of the history of this area. And so in 1949, my parents' generation, when they were young, in their 30s and so on, was a natural starting point. And then 1969, when I was young, seemed another good starting point because that was a time of political ferment as well. Why I chose the third period, which is the Dutch colonial period, is because of, again, because of its political ramifications. There was a feudal society set up here in the home of the brave, land of the free, that we don't often think about. European feudalism was brought to this country, particularly in the Hudson Valley, with first the patroon system and then later the manorial system, which succeeded it. And so I thought that the three periods would work well in terms of the political themes of the book.
And you were an infant in 1949. When you were growing up, did people still talk about those riots?
Very much so. Very much so. When I was doing the book, I paid a visit to Florida to give a reading, and visited with some relatives of mine. And an uncle by marriage was there, and he had been present for the riots. And I said to him, so you went to hear the concert? And he said, hell no, I went to stop it. The first fracas broke out about 7:30. Hesh and his men had stationed themselves just out of sight of the mob at the road's narrowest point. and they backed the camp truck up against their flank to further obstruct the way. If the Patriots got worked up enough to attack, with odds something like 15-1, they had to be held here. If they reached the stage and the women and children, anything could happen. And so they stood there, arm's length, waiting. 32 strangers. A black stevedore in sweatshirt and jeans, a handful of men in merchant marine uniforms, pot-bellied car dealers and liquor store owners and shipping clerks, an encyclopedia salesman from Yonkers, and 3 scared black seminary students who, like the kids at the gate, had come early to serve as ushers. They stood there and listened to the howls and curses of the mob and waited for the police to come and break it up. No one wanted a concert anymore. No one wanted speeches or even the inalienable rights guaranteed under the Constitution. All they wanted, to a man, was to be out of there. And then it started. There was a roar from the crowd, succeeded by a prolonged hiss and clatter that might have been the blast of a tropical storm thrashing the trees. And then the 5 ushers suddenly appeared round the bend, the 3 boys and 2 girls, running for their lives in a hail of rocks and bottles. The look in their eyes was something Hesh had seen before, at Omaha Beach, at Insigny, St. Louis, and Nantes. Both girls were sobbing, and the boy, he couldn't have been more than 15, was bleeding from a gash over his right eye. They passed through the lines, and then Hesh and his recruits locked arms once again. A moment later, the mob was on them. 500 or more strong now, but funneled into the narrow road like cattle in a chute. They burst against the defenders in a frenzied, stick-wielding rush. Hesh was struck across the face, slashed just behind the ear, and battered on both forearms. "Kill the commies," the mob chanted. "Lynch the niggers."
Thomas John Boyle was born in 1948 in Peekskill. His mother was a secretary, his father a mailman. In 2nd and 3rd grade, Boyle was placed in a class for slow learners. As a teenager, he took his mother's family name, Coraghessan. He went to the State College at Potsdam, where he graduated with a C average. And he took on a lifestyle he describes variously as a hood, heroin user, and a hippie. Boyle cleaned up his act when he was accepted to the Iowa Writers' Workshop in 1972. 5 years later, he received his Ph.D. in 19th century British literature. You've dedicated World's End to the memory of your own lost father. How has the connections to your own past informed this novel?
My father was a very laconic man and a very mild-mannered man who supported me in everything I did. He was raised in an orphanage. I am told that he was vivacious and witty, as I think I am, and that his experiences in World War II saddened him in a way that was sort of irretrievable. He died when I was 24 of alcoholism, and I never really got to know him well because I had a particularly long and virulent teenage rebellious period, as you might have guessed, and by the time I would come to the natural rapprochement one has with one's parents, he was already gone. And so, in searching a possible history for myself, a fictional history for my family and myself, it was a way of discovering him in a metaphorical sense.
What was your boyhood like? You had a troubled youth.
Well, my boyhood, up until the ages of 15 and 16, was sort of like Huck Finn, you know, out shooting frogs in the woods and riding my bicycle and so on. I think it was a pretty happy, ideal boyhood up here in the suburbs.
And then you became a 1960s rebel along with a whole generation.
I suppose.
And what were your influences then? I mean, rock and roll, I mean, was it music?
I think I was just swept along with the current like everyone else. You know, you do exactly the opposite of what your parents did so as to outrage them in the maximum way. No one had had hair like that since Wild Bill Cody. No one had had a beard since Abraham Lincoln, so naturally we did that, you know, and sort of repudiated everything our parents stood for. That is, after all, the function of children.
Mm-hmm. And there is this myth that surrounds you of this delinquent who became respectable, of the tough kid. How tough and how delinquent were you?
Well, you must read Greasy Lake to have the final word on that. A pampered punk, you know, who is on the scale of bad of 1 to 10, 10 being the very baddest, about 0.9, 1.5 maybe. There was a time when courtesy and winning ways went out of style, when it was good to be bad, when you cultivated decadence like a taste. We were all dangerous characters then. We wore torn-up leather jackets, slouched around with toothpicks in our mouths, sniffed glue and ether and what somebody claimed was cocaine. When we wheeled our parents' whining station wagons out into the street, we left a patch of rubber half a block long. We drank gin and grape juice, tango, Thunderbird, and Bally High. We were 19. We were bad. We read André Gide and struck elaborate poses to show that we didn't give a shit about anything. At night, we went up to Greasy Lake. Through the center of town, up the strip, past the housing developments and shopping malls, streetlights giving way to the thin, streaming illumination of the headlights. Trees crowding the black, unbroken wall of asphalt. That was the way out to Greasy Lake. The Indians had called it Wakan, a reference to the clarity of its waters. Now it was fetid and murky, the mud banks glittering with broken glass and strewn with beer cans and the charred remains of bonfires. There was a single ravaged island 100 yards from shore, so stripped of vegetation it looked as if the Air Force had strafed it. We went up to the lake because everyone went there, because we wanted to snuff the rich scent of possibility on the breeze, watch a girl take off her clothes and plunge into the festering murk, drink beer, smoke pot, howl at the stars, savor the incongruous, full-throated roar of rock and roll against the primeval susurrus of frogs and crickets. This was nature.
Tell me in World's End how you went about creating the 17th century Dutch culture.
Again, I relied heavily on Washington Irving, texts from the period, historical texts which I found here. The Peekskill Library has a wonderful little room called the Peekskill Room, and you can use it by appointment only. And when I was thinking about the book, actually I was writing the stories for Greasy Lake at the time, I rented a place in Mohegan Colony, which is the stand-in for Kitchewank Colony in my book, and did research here in New York. And I went to the Peekskill Room, I made an appointment, and there is the curator of the Peekskill Room, waiting for me. He welcomed me warmly. All I had to do was mention a subject, and he heaped books in my lap. He was absolutely wonderful. After several days there, just he and I, in the room, his voice broke slightly, and he said to me, "Fascinating, isn't it?" And then I knew what he was doing in the Peekskill Room. You know, just this stuff is amazing, you know, the history of the area.
And how did food come to play such a big role in this novel?
Well, I think after I took off the first 200 pounds in Weight Watchers, food has been very important to me ever since. I don't know, I think it has something to do with appetite and control of appetites, but food is, has been an obsessive theme in many of my works, as you know. And I think that I probably do it, write about food so obsessively in so many works, not because I'm 30 pounds underweight, but because I was a graduate student at one time, and I really thought it would be nice to provide a subject for a graduate student's thesis, food in the work of Boyle. It began with Harmonius. He came in from the fields one night and sat down at the table with an appetite so keen it cut at him like a sword. While Agatha busied herself with a chutzpah of turnips, onions, and venison, she set out a 5-pound wheel of milk cheese and a loaf of day-old Bruinbrod, hard as stone. Flies and mosquitoes hung in the air. The children, playing at tag, shouted from the yard. When she turned round, bread and cheese were gone, and her husband sat contemplating the crumbs with a strange, vacant gaze, the hard muscles working in his jaw. "My God, Harmonius," she laughed. "Save something for the children." It wasn't till supper that she became alarmed. Besides the stew, it was enough for the next 3 days at least. There was a game pie, another loaf, 2 pounds of butter, garden salad, and a stone jar of creamed fish. The children barely had time to fill their plates. Harmonius lashed into the eatables as if he were sitting down to the Pinkster eating contest at the Skobiaken Tavern. Jeremias and Wouter ran off to kick a ball in the fading light, but Katrinchi, who'd stayed behind to clear up, watched in awe as her father attacked the pie, shoveled up the creamed fish with a wedge of bread, scraped the stew pot clean. He sat at the table for nearly 2 hours, and in all that time not a word escaped his lips, but for the occasional mumbled request for water, cider, or bread. In the morning, it was no different. He was up at first light, as usual, but instead of taking a loaf from the table and heading out with axe or plow, he lingered in the kitchen. "What is it, Harmonis?" Agatha asked, a trace of apprehension creeping into her voice. He sat at the crude table, big hands folded before him, and looked up at her, and she thought for a moment she was looking into the eyes of a stranger. "I'm hungry," he said. She was sweeping the floorboards, her elbows jumping like mice. "Shall I make some eggs?" He nodded. "And meat." Just then, Katrinchi stepped through the door with a pail of fresh milk. Harmonis nearly kicked the table over. "Milk," he said, as if associating word and object for the first time. His voice was flat, dead, without intonation, the voice of a phantom. He snatched the pail from her hands, lifted it to his lips, and drank without pause till it was empty. Then he threw it to the floor, belched, and looked round the room as if he'd never seen it before. "Eggs," he repeated. "Meat." By this point, the whole family was frightened. Jeremias looked on with a pale face as his father ate his way through the larder, wrestled sturgeon from the smokehouse, plucked a pair of hens from the pot. Katrinchi and Agatha flew round the kitchen, chopping, kneading, frying, and baking. Wouter was sent for wood. Steam rose from the kettle. There was no work in the fields that day. Harmonis ate till early afternoon, ate till he'd ravaged the garden, emptied the cellar, threatened the livestock. His shirt was a patchwork of grease, egg yolk, sauce, and cider. He looked drunk, like one of the Geneva-soaked beggars on the Herengracht in Amsterdam. Then all at once, he staggered up from the table as if he'd been wounded, and fell on a pallet in the corner. He was asleep before he hit the straw.
You've said elsewhere that you'd like to be the Kurt Vonnegut of your generation, and basically you almost just said that just now, that you would like to entertain as well as inform, do something serious, but have it be light and entertaining at the same time.
Very much so. I think the greatest artists, like Charles Dickens, who was one of my heroes, and like Vonnegut too, have reached a wide audience. The critics can appreciate it. The academics, sniffing their beards can appreciate it. And so can the people in the street. I think that's what great art is about. I think maybe 20 years ago, literature became so hermetic, so much a product of the academy, that we began to lose our audience. And I like to consider myself, or remind myself when I'm writing, that the bottom line is that this is an entertainment. Literature is enjoyable. It's fun. Everything else is secondary.
It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. T.C. Boyle.
Thank you. Thank you. The title of my lecture tonight is Shakespeare, Playwright or Elvis? Only kidding. Actually,
Some fiction writers let their work speak for itself. T. Coraghessan Boyle prefers to perform. At the State University at Albany, dressed like a rock star, he reads a story about a Hollywood press agent trying to improve the image of the Ayatollah.
So anyway, they usher us into this room, different house than yesterday, by the way. And there he is, the Ayatollah, propped up on about 100 pillows and giving us his lizard on a rock look. Hoji's there too, of course, along with all the other Ayatollah clones with their raggedy beards and pillbox hats. Soon as Hoji gets a load of Parvis, though, he can see what's coming, and he throws some kind of fit, teeth flashing in his beard, his face bruised up like a bag of bad plums, pissing and moaning and pointing at me and Parvis like we just got done raping his mother or something. But hey, I've taken some meetings in my time, and if I can't handle it, Bob, I mean, who can? So I just kind of brush right by Hoji, a big closer's smile on my face, and shake the old bird's hand. And I mean, nobody shakes his hand. Nobody's laid skin on him in maybe 10 years, at least since the revolution, anyway. But I figured a guy used to live in Paris, right? He's got to have a nose for a good bottle of wine, a plate of crayfish, Havana cigars, the track. He's probably dying for somebody to press some skin and shoot the bull about life in a civilized world. So I shake his hand, and the room tenses up. But at least it shuts up Hoji for a minute, and I see my opening. Parvis, I yell over my shoulder. Tell him that I said we got the same goal, which is positive name-face recognition worldwide. I mean, billboards on Sunset, the works. And if he listens to me and cleans up his act a little, I'm 99% sure we're going home. Well, Parvis starts in, and right away Hoji cuts him off with this high-octane rap. But the Ayatollah flicks his eyes, and it's like the guy just had the tongue ripped out of his head. I mean, incredible. Bang, that's it. Hoji ducks his head, and he's gone. And me? I'm smiling like Mr. Cool. Parvis goes ahead and finishes, and the old bird clears his throat and croaks something back. I'm not even looking at Parvis, just holding the Ayatollah's eyes. By the way, I swear he dyes his eyebrows. And I go, what'd he say? And Parvis tells me, twice. Thing is, I can't understand a word he says, but the hell with it, I figure. Be positive, right? Okay, I say. Seeing as how we're finally getting down to brass tacks. About the beard. Tell him Beards went out with Jim Morrison. And the bathrobe business is kind of kinky, and we can plait it out if he wants. But wouldn't he feel more comfortable in a nice Italian knit? The big guy says nothing. But I can see this kind of glimmer in his eyes, and I know he's digging it. I mean, I can feel it. And I figure we'll worry about the grooming later, and I cut right to the heart of it and lay my big idea on him. The idea that's going to launch the whole campaign. This is genius, Bob. You're going to love it. I ask myself, how do we soften this guy a little? You know, break down the barriers between him and the public, turn all that negative shit around. And what audience are we targeting here? Think about it. He can have all the camel drivers and Kalashnikov toters in the world, but let's face it, the bottom line is how does he go down over here, and that's like Nowheresville. So my idea is this. Baseball. Yeah, baseball. Where would Castro be without it? What can the American public relate to? And I'm talking the widest sector now, from the guys in the boardroom to the schlump with the jackhammer out the window there. Better than baseball. Can you dig it? The Ayatollah's a closet baseball fan, but his people need him so much, love him, a country in battle. He's like a Winston Churchill to them. They won't let him come to New York for a Yankees game. Can you picture it? No? Well, dig the photo. Yeah, from yesterday's New York Times. See the button there on his bathrobe? Well, maybe it is a little fuzzy. AP's the pits. But that's a Go Yankees button I gave him myself. Now listen, he liked it, Bob. He liked it. I could tell. I mean, I lay the concept on him, and he goes off into this fucking soliloquy, croaking up a storm, and then Parvis tells me it's okay, but it's all over for today. He's got to have his hat surgically removed or something. And the guys with the Uzis are closing in again. But I'm seeing green, Bob. I'm seeing him maybe throwing out the first ball this spring. Yankees versus the Reds or Pirates. Okay, wrong league. The Birds then. I'm telling you, the sun on his face, Brooks Brothers draping his shoulders, the cameras whirring, and the arc of that ball just going on and on, out over the grass, across the airwaves, and into the lap of every regular Joe in America. Believe me, Bob, it's in the bag. Thanks.